Yes, so welcome. This is part 1 of 2 with the Northern Sunrise County and the ALUS program. This is a discussion and I guess learning a little bit about beavers in our landscape and how they fit and sometimes don't fit, and the values and benefits, as also acknowledging some of the challenges that they can pose when we have humans and beavers living in the same habitats, basically. So the first part that we're going to talk about tonight is just some sort of beaver basics, so ecology, natural history, and watershed connections, as well as acknowledge and identify some of the challenges that beavers pose. And then hopefully you can join us for part 2 next week, where we'll get more into some of the different tools that are available for coexisting with beaver. Some of the issues around where those things are suitable, where they're not, and then also have a bit of a discussion about, where can we bring beavers into the realm and understanding so that they can actually help us maybe with some of the issues that we face as humans. So Cows and Fish does these workshops as part of a collaborative with the Mistaki Institute, and through grants from the Watershed Resiliency and Restoration Program from Alberta Environment. So who is Cows and Fish? We're a not-for-profit organization, and we work on education, awareness, understanding, management of riparian lands to have a healthy functioning landscape for the benefit of all. And our goal is to promote stewardship within people that live, work, and play on the landscape, so that you guys can make better decisions, or the best decisions possible, both for ecosystems and ecosystem services, as well as yourselves and your operations if you're an ag producer or wherever you might live in the watershed. We operate on a bit of a pathway, and I think when we start talking about beavers, this really makes a lot of sense, because first of all, we want to understand them a little bit better so that we know why they do what they do, and that might help us recognize where we can mitigate some of the issues. Teams are getting a bunch of different people together to figure out how we can address or solve an issue. So that is the beginning of what we're doing tonight. Tools, all the different things that can actually help resolve an issue. And then, talking about some places where in the beaver story, where people have increased their tolerance or are trying to manage and mitigate beavers a little bit differently than maybe some of the traditional past means, or where those kind of conventional management tools are still being used as well. And then tracking and seeing how things are going through progress and monitoring. So we've mentioned the word riparian. So Cows and Fish is also known as the Alberta Riparian Habitat Management Society. And the riparian landscape is that transition zone between uplands and open water aquatic zones. So where do beavers like to live? Right in that zone. So they are a critical piece of how riparian areas have evolved over time in Alberta and through North America and around the world. There's all kinds of different things that use riparian areas, including humans, and beavers are just one part of that. And you may have heard them called keystone species. It's with that beaver habitat on the landscape that we can have a lot of the other things that we also like to see. So why is a group called Cows and Fish talking about beavers? Well, we've done a really good job over the years of developing materials and education and information about grazing management, urban riparian management, lakes and wetlands around cottage and development areas. But we always had the question about, well, where did beavers fit in? And we didn't really have, up until about 5 years ago, some similar materials to share about the beaver. So since then, through that collaborative that I mentioned at the beginning, we've developed a number of educational materials, both booklets, fact sheets, online resources, as well as these workshops that kind of help bring that conversation about beaver to the forefront. And normally this workshop would be done in person over the course of a day. And so we're really pleased that you're able to find some time this evening over, and hopefully over 2 evenings, to allow us to work through this workshop with you in the online format. So let's start with Beaver basics. So for Canadians, I mean, beavers are featured prominently in many aspects of our lives. I mean, from the nickel in your pocket to the hundreds of place names that that are named after the beaver. We've got, you know, we've sort of made them front and center in some of our history, and played a really key part in even settlement of our nation. So some of the areas, you know, up in, I'm coming to you from Grand Prairie this evening, up here doing some other work. You know, Beaver Lodge is not too far away from here. So everything from counties to towns to streams, lakes, rivers, the beaver has played a prominent role in sort of developing how we think about our landscape. So whether you love them or hate them, I think we should at least pay homage to them, because when we stop and think about it, it was the lure of the beaver pelt that brought Europeans to North America. Now, it was to feed the fashion frenzy for felt hats over in Europe, but it kind of, you know, that particular thing, and the trade for beaver in the early, you know, 1600s stimulated the exploration and mapping of most of North America, changed the life of the lives of Native peoples living here, contributed to the economic base of early governments, led to the formation of our continent's first multinational corporations, and really laid the foundations for the development of our nation. So not too bad for a 20-kilogram rodent. Now, modern beavers have been around for, you know, over 1 million years or something, and they overlapped a little bit with the prehistoric giant beavers, which were about the size of a small black bear. And so, I mean, we wouldn't want to be running into those guys right now. So maybe our current beavers aren't so bad. So that lure for the beaver pelts basically resulted in the European version of the beaver, the European species, to be just about extirpated over there. So when they found out that North America had a bunch, then that, like we said, that brought people over. So in North America, there was estimated that there was about 4.7 million beaver pelts made it to auction houses in the early 17 to 1800s. So that's a lot of animals, and that doesn't count the great many pelts that didn't make it to grade and were discarded. So for you know, for the beaver, they made it through, you know, 1 million years or however many years of living with, you know, large cats and big other four-legged things, but it was the appearance of the human that just about did them in. So some of you may have heard about Archie Bellany, also known as Gray Owl. Early on in the early 1900s, he was a person that sort of started in on some early conservation, started to recognize the value of beaver, and began to do some sort of reintroduction and conservation initiatives to try to bring the beavers back so that we didn't lose them entirely. So in the 1950s, the declining markets and prices for fur allowed some of the beaver populations to rebound, but they still weren't quite at, you know, what they were pre to the prehistoric levels. So there are a number of different ways to reintroduce beaver, and this is an early experiment where a remote area in Idaho, where they literally put some beavers on a parachute, dropped them in the back country because they couldn't get there with roads. And that was the way of reintroducing beavers, trying to find a population in that Idaho country. Incidentally, from all the stories, only one perished, and they've continued to thrive in that area. So in some provinces, like Saskatchewan, as far as we know, there continues to be beaver bounties in place to basically, try and manage and mitigate beavers. They've been considered a pest in Alberta since the early 1950s or 60s, I believe. And so they've always kind of gotten a bad rap. And again, sometimes it's well deserved, but other times we may have overlooked some of the benefits that they can have. And in the last, last several years, there's been a bit of a shift to recognizing some of those values. People like Dr. Glynis Hood at the University of Alberta. If you've seen the Beaver Whisperers documentary, there's, a bit of an idea thinking, oh, well, how can we utilize beaver maybe to our benefit, as opposed to just thinking about them as, as a pest and a rodent. So through this workshop, we want to talk about, are beavers good? Are they bad? Or are they just being beaver? And at Cows and Fish, we want to bring sort of a balanced message in terms of what they can do for us, but also acknowledging that there are going to be challenges if we want to get to a point where we can coexist with them in some way, shape, or form. So let's touch a little bit on basic beaver biology, because in understanding them might help us, again, better live with them. So beavers have been termed ecosystem engineers. And so it's quite a package. Swims like a fish, cuts like a chainsaw, moves materials like a front-end loader, and is the water engineer and the first logger that transforms landscapes like we humans do. They've got those long incisor teeth, so they give them that buck-tooth beaver name. They're infused with iron, and they're harder on one side than the other, so that they can continue to sharpen as they grow throughout the beaver's life. So the beaver colony is a family operation. At its hub is the adult female. So she's the dominant and leads the efforts in terms of maintaining the lodge, caching winter food, and keeping dams functional. The adults create a monogamous relationship until one of them dies, and they breed in the winter with an average litter of 4 kits born in the spring. So typically in a beaver lodge, there's 2 adults, 2 young of the year, and 2 two-year-olds. And you may see just one big lodge in an area, but there may also be sort of adjacent lodges as well. And that's typically members of the same family that are figuring out how to cohabitate. So beavers have 2 sort of structures that they build. One is the lodge, and that's their home. That's their protection. And they may be, a lodge out in open water, or they may also be a bank den that is sort of adjacent, to maybe sometimes a flowing water body, or just on the side. So this provides places for them to hide, keeps them warm in the winter, places where they can cache their food and have their young. So the lodge is the beaver's castle, and the pond that they need to create to build that thing is the moat. So you may have been out and about seeing these sort of mounds of dirt that are pushed up around areas where beavers are active, and those are their scent mounds, and that's how they sort of mark where their territories are. So at about the age of 2, those sort of young adult beavers will start to sort of leave the colony and go out and find their own spaces. And generally that coincides with spring runoff, because it's easy enough for them to get around. Sometimes they'll go, 8 to 16 kilometers or so, the research would say, from sort of where they grow up. But they've also been known to, to travel very, very long distances. So as you know, beavers are herbivores. They eat the cellulose and sort of the material underneath the bark, and they've got certain gut bacteria that allow them to digest that material. So the wood is cut, transported, and collected. And if you see outside of a lodge, a bunch of sticks and leaves sticking up, particularly in the fall and the winter, that's their food cache, and that's how they keep themselves going throughout the cold winter months. The bases are submerged, and that allows them to access that food supply without having to come up and risk predation. So they've got a pretty long lifespan. They can live up to 16 years in the wild, but that would be exceptional, given all the different types of mortality that can happen to them. 1 out of 3 beavers won't make it every year. So things like predation, disease, trapping account for most of that mortality, but also starvation, water level fluctuations, and the human element can all be ever-present dangers. So you may have heard that Giardia, which is also known as beaver fever. Beavers are one of the many mammals that actually carry that cyst, and one study shows that actually more muskrats can carry that cyst than beavers do. So instead of beaver fever, maybe they could have called it muskrat fever. So let's take a look at the beavers' world. So they're best known for their dam building talents. The sight and sound of running water is the trigger that prompts a beaver to start building a dam. So the goal is to impound water with those sticks and those mud embankments in order to create enough depth that they can have their lodge, and it will not basically freeze to the bottom in the winter. So ideally, if you've got a pond that's changing water levels, they like it to be fairly stable, and they need to have about 3/4 of a meter of open water under ice to survive over winter. So if you've got a pond with that kind of depth, it's likely that you can maintain and have a beaver colony throughout the winter. So the dams and ponds are variable in shape, as you've likely, if you've ever walked out across one or near one, you'll see that it's always kind of leaking. It's like it's a leaky dam. It's a weird kind of engineering, but they do that for a reason, and that's basically to allow reduce the amount of pressure that builds up behind them so that the dams don't blow out. The largest beaver dam in the world is actually up in Wood Buffalo National Park, and you can see it even from Google Earth. So if you've ever been up there or just want to go on a Google Earth virtual tour, it's pretty neat to see that they've been busy in that region for a number of years and created a dam that I believe is about 850 meters long. So the trees and the branches are kind of like, they anchor the sediment that they build up from the bottom. So there's a sort of an excavating aspect to the dam building, as well as the trees and using whatever materials that they can find. Sometimes they find cattails, they'll use those. Sometimes they'll take the lumber. I don't know if anybody heard about that, but there was, they were using some stashed lumber from a yard. They'd taken that to build their dam with. And I've also heard somebody tell me that they lost their canoe once and found it nicely embedded in the dam as well. So anything that can be moved, mobilized, they will use it. So as I mentioned, they're kind of leaky and wet, and sometimes they're really tall, and that's sort of a sign of a well-maintained long-term beaver dam. And some are a lot smaller, and those are usually the ones that are just getting started. So, and often where there's one dam, there's more dams, and that's also by design. The main pond is going to be the one where the beavers have their lodge. So there's going to have the most water, but then they also need a series of dams below and sometimes above, which are intended to help them move their material from different parts of the landscape. So that extends the swimming range and ensures a better year-round water supply for them. So I think they've become fairly adaptable. You know, they can live in pretty much anywhere, but generally they need to have that sort of adequate water supply, like we talked about. They don't, you know, like a system that moves too fast, because they wouldn't be able to keep up with it. The valley width can range, but generally, if it's wide and flat, that works well for them. And then they also need that aspen and willow community, which is the woody food supply. So this sort of presentation combines practical information as well as a synthesis of research that our colleague Lauren Fitch went through a few years ago and did. And so through that research, you know, it suggests that you need about an acre of aspen to support a beaver colony, so 6 individuals, for that 1 to 2.5 years. Now, of course, that can change and vary, but that's a bit of a guide. So a poll for you guys. What do you think the proportion of a beaver's annual diet is, proportion of wood is in the beaver's annual diet? So the right answer over annual is 53%. Say the right answer because that's just what the research has told us. But the diet varies seasonally. So I think it makes sense that in the winter that would make up the most. Spring and summer, it's not as prominent because they also eat cattails, bulrushes, water lilies, pond lilies, duckweed, and other grasses and forbs. So as those more, I guess, non-woody plants start to die off throughout the season, then the wood becomes more prominent. And as we saw the food cache, that's what they're going to be eating throughout the winter. Beavers prefer to use the trees that are about, you know, that size or so, kind of that sapling age class, but they will attack. They will go after some bigger ones. And sometimes they're successful getting them down and sometimes they're not. And so this is a scene that we'd have to get used to, you know, if we wanted to try and have beavers coexisting with us. So they'll travel. Obviously, it makes sense. They take the stuff that's closest to their pond first, and then they will travel away from the pond to try and continue to gather that that material. And often, if you see a lot of trees coming down in an area, that's a sign of new beaver. They're trying to basically get established in that area. If you've got a colony that's been around for a long time, typically there's a starter period, right, where they really go great guns, getting those trees down, and then it becomes a maintenance issue or a maintenance project after that, if everything else kind of stays stable. So you can see maybe, that the pond is one thing, that's surface water, but then there's also all these other canals and things that that beavers also make. And again, that's part of the process of giving them safe passage to their food supplies. So aspen and willow are their favorite, but they'll also eat other species. But it's interesting about aspen and willow because they've kind of grown up and evolved with beaver. So willows will sprout and regenerate really quickly after beavers have chewed them. And aspen as well, they'll send up sprouts, and they have a bit of a a taste to them that sort of deters the beaver for a while, so that they don't come back to that plant. And so that basically means that those trees can continue to grow up, and then the cycle can continue. So sometimes, in those aspen dominated systems, the tree regrowth isn't fast enough to sustain a colony, and the beaver may have to move on because the risk and reward for getting the wood there becomes too much. So that's usually when dams start to fail, is when the beaver really can't maintain themselves there anymore. So the cycle of establishment, like I said, can be about 10 years or up to 30 years. And how long a beaver can stay in an area is based on, mortality, predation, availability of food supply, availability of their other seasonal diet components, whether we're in drought years or flood years, because we do know that, that can change the amount of water that we've got, and, how well the woody plant community can respond. So as, as beaver ponds on the landscape change and evolve, sometimes there'll be a pond there. Sometimes it'll fill in to be, more like a wetland. And other times, like we talked about, those dams will fail and they'll go back to a stream channel for a while. So that's kind of the succession of a beaver pond. And whether it's in the southern part of the province or up here in the boreal forest, those activities are prevalent on the landscape, and in a lot of cases, helped build a lot of the floodplains and really productive soils that we have here in Alberta and across the West, really, in North America. So, I mean, given 10,000 years of trapping sediment and building sediment and creating these ponds and riparian zones, they continue to have a profound effect on the landscape that we at Cows and Fish are particularly interested in, and that we hope that you are too, is because they can, they've changed a lot of our stream channels so much over time. This is an interesting schematic, I think, that just sort of shows that, once the glaciers left, for example, we had a lot of V-shaped valleys, so a lot of tight valleys like that. And as beavers did their process of, trapping sediment, creating a dam, allowing that material to accumulate and plants to grow, they basically they lifted and flattened some of those V-shaped valleys so that they became more U-shaped. And that, in the end, as I touched on, is how we got a lot of our wide floodplains in some parts of the province. So the role of the beaver pond and the beaver dam also is related to water quality. So that sediment that is trapped is also being cleaned by that wetland, by the plants and things like that. So the excess nutrients like phosphorus can help with water quality for fish, other aquatic animals, other domestic animals, and humans alike. So the beaver ponds are a combination of something that slows down water, allowing sediment to settle out, and creating cleaner water for fish. So if this is a situation upstream of a beaver dam, as ideally this is not happening, but if it is, the beaver dam is going to help try and mitigate this issue further downstream. So the amount of sediment that can be trapped in beaver ponds is pretty astounding. It's 382 tandem dump truck equivalent that can be stored in each of those dams. So you can imagine on a watershed scale, that's a lot of sediment that, when in a stream channel, could be causing algae blooms or suffocating fish eggs, things like that. So the first option is to prevent that sediment from getting into the water first with our upland management. But for any materials that do get in, then the beaver can help with that issue with that. So everything from suspended solids, phosphorus, nitrogen, carbon, reduced fecal coliforms, and increased dissolved oxygen are all the things that can happen downstream of a beaver dam. So this little graph down here just sort of supports that theory, that the research here above the beaver dam, there was a lot of suspended sediment, but below it was trapped behind and then didn't flow through. So not only water quality is affected by beaver dams and beaver ponds, but also water quantity. So they have the ability to recharge groundwater as well as store surface water. And that's incredible. That's important for us because that allows water to be present and be released throughout the year, and then especially vital during drought times. So there's been research around that, and basically, I wonder if I've got the next slide. Yeah, so down around Edmonton, which is actually where I'm from, there was some research done in the driest parts of the early 2000s. And basically that research suggested and almost 9-fold of the open water in that area was held in beaver ponds. So think about the importance of that, not only for wildlife, but also for, say, livestock producers, where they need a water source for their animals. That beaver pond can provide that, particularly in those dry years. And how does that, again, how is that water sort of spread out? It's not just what we can see on the surface, but those canals and groundwater connections is how they can contribute to that groundwater storage as well. And generally, what we can see above is just a small snapshot of the influence on the shallow groundwater, which is important for growing plants and for for wells and drinking water supply, that sort of thing, as well as then again maintaining downstream flows. So if you were going to sum up sort of the value of a beaver pond, it comes down to retention, detention, storage, and slow release. So those dams, they also create speed bumps. So as water flows, it has energy, and it has energy to erode and move material. And that material is typically sediment or eroding banks and depositing banks elsewhere. So if there's something to slow that water down, that decreases the risk and costs of flooding, and then also slows down that erosion. So there's a value in that because it can reduce and mitigate the sort of how fast water flows off the landscape, which can help us with flood and drought mitigation. Keeping more water longer is actually better for reducing the damages that can be caused by fast flash flood and fast moving water. So those dams and those ponds, those sort of step pools that are created, decreases the velocity and power, spreads water over a larger area, which then allows it to soak in, and that reduces flood peaks and also redirects flows to other places. So in the riparian world, when we talk about floods and things like that, we actually say that they're not a 4-letter word, unless we've, as humans, built our infrastructure in such a place that creates that sort of a situation. So we actually do need that flooding to happen, and in order for these systems to be healthy. So, but if we can slow down the rate at which that flooding happens, then that's a benefit. And just some additional research that again supports the line with the big peak is sort of how fast water was moving above the beaver area, and then this is what it was like below. So that again, the research supports that that concept. Controlling the thermostat. So this is another piece of the riparian and beaver puzzle. Being able to keep water temperatures cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter, which is a benefit to a lot of our fish species, particularly our native trout, and also, if we're going further to the coast, also salmon as well. So there's some interesting information, coming out about the impacts of, or the relationship, I guess, between beaver ponds and fish. And these are just some of the highlights. The native fish can typically pass beaver dams. They help with sustained year-round flow, so that just means more water for spawning, either in the spring or in the fall. Typically, the water that's coming out of the beaver dam is cooler. And then, of course, just those ideas of cleaning water and creating habitats also just helps with the fish's life cycle. And in addition to those, in water living things, there's also all the other different animals that rely on riparian lands for all or part of their life cycle. And it may not be just the ones that live on the stream. There's ones that are passing through. They're they're just nesting there, or they rear their young and then they're off on their way, or they use them as part of their travel corridors and for protection. So when these systems are healthy and we've got all the different pieces sort of working together, then we've got that biodiversity and that resiliency in our plant and animal communities. And beavers have a big role to play in that. Everything, yeah, from the littlest frog up to waterfowl and birds, up to the big charismatic megafauna like bears and moose and things like that. And by, again, the network that beavers create, that allows a lot of these other animals to also get through to different habitats. And the longer that we can keep and maintain beaver dams, wetlands, riparian areas in general, that's going to improve sort of our watershed resiliency and our ability to respond to different things, whether it's flood, whether it's drought or fire, things like that. So on the concept of fire, I mean, there's also new research around that suggests that areas that have beaver dams have natural fire breaks and wetter and moister habitats. So that can actually reduce the impacts of some of the fires that we may see going forward. So that's, I guess, another piece of that puzzle to think about. And beavers in Alberta, they're present in all of our natural regions, everything from south to north, east to west, and have had, like we've said, a profound impact on the way that our watersheds are developed. So we're sort of wrapping that up, the warm and fuzzy part of the workshop, we call this. They've got the ability to modify channels and the hydrology that we have on our landscapes. They've got that ability to store and trap and hold sediments and organic materials and excess nutrients that, as they move through the watershed, can create some other challenges. They're kind of like wetland builders. They can modify a nutrient cycling, increase the area that is sort of riparian, that wetter than dry, but that transition zone and if you want to call it, the last line of defense. And then they've got that influence on water quality as well as habitat modifications for so many other different animals. At this point, I think we can pause for a minute. And Becky, are there any questions in the chat?
No, there isn't, Carrie.
There aren't. Okay. I guess I'll maybe just open it up to you guys that if you've got one that you want to type in there, go ahead and we can try and answer it. Okay. And if not, that's okay. We can we've got time at the end as well.
Okay, I have uploaded some of the links that you provided, so
okay,
they're in the chat.
Good. Yeah, so a lot of this, the information being provided tonight is available through some of those resources, and there'll be more to follow in part 2 as well, if if you're getting curious about some of the other coexistence tools as well.
Oh, can you talk a bit about benefits specific to urban river systems rather than wetlands?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a similar benefit. Being able to maintain the flow that you've got in an urban river system is often part and parcel to what's happening in the watershed. So the watershed being all the other parts, all the other wetlands, all the other smaller tributary streams that are feeding that river. So I think that's one big benefit. And then I think once you've got that water, then all the other things kind of follow. Then you've got biodiversity. So you've got, bird watching opportunities, things like that. Do they potentially, if you've got beaver right in the urban center, is there potentially some issues with trees? Absolutely. But they're also, when they're taking some trees down, particularly in a bit more of a non-yard setting, their ultimate goal is to grow more trees so that they can come back and perpetuate that cycle.
Okay, Carrie, we have a couple more questions here. Are beavers protected by environmental laws?
At this point, they're not. No, they're not protected. So they are. There's no. We don't really have a good idea of what the population estimates are, but in talking to some of our colleagues in Alberta environment, basically they're not concerned about them at all. So, not protected.
Okay. How can you coexist with a beaver who has built a massive dam, and how do pond levelers work? That might be, you might have to come back next time.
Yeah, that one we might have to come back for next time. But Becky's going to touch on that a little bit right in your presentation. Becky, you're going to talk about your example.
Yeah.
A little bit. So there's no doubt that they can come in conflict with some of the things that we want to do. And the way that a pond leveler works, I can touch on that part, is that by putting that leveler in the dam at a certain height, that basically mitigates the amount of flow that beaver dam can have. So if the pond level right now is too high, you can set that pipe at a lower level, say a foot or two below, and then water will continue to flow out of the pond until it reaches that sort of more tolerable level of water.
Thank you. More questions. Can you give examples of how agricultural landowners and beavers can coexist?
Well, let's see. That too, I think, will come up really well. Really well in the next session. But similar idea to coming up with tools where you can maintain a pond that can be a water source for livestock, for example. So I think that's one fairly obvious one. If it's a grazing operation, actually working with that riparian area as part of your grazing lands, but not necessarily relying on it for all parts of the year or every year for that, for example. So actually creating a set, I'll call it a setback, but an area where it allows the riparian lands and where the beavers probably are to sort of do their thing with flexibility of grazing it in times when maybe the beavers aren't there.
What if they're grain farmers?
Yeah, so grain farmers, the idea of setback is the same, right? Being able to recognize that, like, the idea of creating a buffer. So the idea of a buffer is that it's an area between where the crop ends and sort of where that water may or may not be, depending on the year. And again, planning and allowing for sometimes that area to just be riparian and be wet.
Okay, another question. Are they considered pests by some?
Yeah, yeah, to some they are. And I think for a lot of time, they were actually on the Alberta Pest Act. And so a lot of the work that municipalities do is around is around that, is managing beaver impacts on our infrastructure. So yeah, to some they are, and at one time they were actually regulated as such.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Carrie. And we are at the end of the question session.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you for those questions. I really wish that we could be doing this in person. All right. So poll number 4. This kind of lends itself to the conversation that we just had, which was great. But what do you think what to you, what is the biggest issue or challenge with beavers on our landscape? And it could be nothing. So I put that as an option as well. Maybe you don't have any issues or challenges, or maybe there's something else. Okay. Some are okay. Blocked culverts, cutting down trees, flooded roads, and flooded pastures and fields. Okay, cool. So this next section is, I guess, going to be, acknowledging some of those things. And then just, really briefly, I'm going to touch on kind of what some of the options are for dealing with those things. I'm not going to go into super much detail. So if there's more questions about that sort of thing, we can have that discussion as we follow up with the Q&A at the end. So there's no doubt that that living with wildlife, particularly beavers, isn't easy, and they can make the case for living with them that it's just too frustrating, it's too expensive, it's too time consuming, and just why bother? But the perceptions about beaver seem to depend on whether or not you've had a negative effect or a negative impact with them. So if you've had problems with them, you're likely going to think not too highly of them. And if you haven't, you're likely thinking it's okay. We can keep them. We can keep them on the landscape, no problem. So understanding beavers is one of the first steps in dealing with the challenges that they bring. So I hope that first section kind of gave you guys some things to think about maybe, why the beaver are where they are, and why they might be doing some of the things that they're doing. So the range of issues that beavers can pose and the conflicts that they can pose is high. So we want to acknowledge that. And one of them, as you guys have already touched on, is the flooding of lands. So whether it's roads or pastures or fields, whether it's a hay crop or an annual crop, flooding fence lines, damages to fence line from downed trees, interrupting recreational opportunities with their, effective timber removal. Impacts on infrastructure, flooding, that sometimes can diminish land values and make construction difficult, and and things like that. I think the question is, I want to think about, we're going to address these issues, but why are they issues? Right? Is it because the beaver is doing what they're doing, or is it because we're infringing on where the beaver is doing its thing? So I just pose that challenge. The risk of dam blowouts with downstream flooding is a concern for some people, but in an active beaver situation, they tend not to fail because they're flat. They've got that wide dispersal of energy, and usually what happens is they begin to fail once the beavers leave an area, or if we may have a large flood event that just can't hold that down. So buried somewhere in this photo is a culvert. There she is, right about there. nicely plugged by a beaver. So that creates consternation for a lot of municipalities because they are, threatening road infrastructure, changing the way that roads and things work. So, and above that plugged culvert then, is a flooded county road. And again, lots of times we create these vortexes that mean faster running water, which means Beaver says, yep, I'm going to plug that. And I never thought of this until somebody said, and it just makes so much sense, a road bed with a culvert in it. Just going to see if I can pause this. A road bed with a culvert in it is basically, a signal to a beaver that says, I got to stop that thing because it's letting water out of my pond. So there's coexistence ideas for that as well, ways to try and help with that as well. Things like, collapsed beaver tunnels or collapsed old lodges can create footing issues for both humans as well as livestock. If you've ever been out for a hike in a beaver landscape, you may have fallen into one of these beaver canals, and sometimes they're over 1 meter deep. But again, now we understand why they're there, right? Those canals are helping that landscape expand, and the beaver just wants to keep more water and more resources for them for their survival. They like to chew things, as we know, trees and that of course is kind of number one, but they'll also chew through telephone wires. You may have heard in the news in the last couple of months that they took out the internet in a small BC community because they went after fiber optic cables. They've been known to chew through PVC pipe, as well as a lot of some trees that may or may not be prized possessions in people's yards. So typically, the beaver is really industrious, and they can make it a little bit difficult to love them as a result. But again, recognizing that there are probably places where that kind of a scene is okay, and and allowing it to happen, and where it's not, what can we do about that? So they can be very, very busy, and their actions can create conflict with ours at times, and they also cheerfully ignore our property lines, and often one thing happening on one neighbor's property can affect the other. So this is just sort of the teaser, I guess, for the next session, but there are a number of management options that people are starting to think about, not only here in Alberta, but around the world. And maybe it's not just about population management and beaver removal and the removal of dams, that maybe there are some ways that we can come up with a way to have all those benefits that we talked about, but then reduce the challenges and the concerns that they pose as well. So barriers are things like, what can you do to protect a culvert? Habitat management is kind of what we talked about in terms of setting aside areas for beavers just to be beavers, and creating those areas where they can have willows and they can have aspens, so that they have habitat that then maybe they'll leave other areas alone. Deterrence, again, those are ways of sort of redirecting the beavers elsewhere. Repellents, those are things, again, like that that you can basically make an area kind of what's the word, not so enticing. And then the population management, of course, that's around removal. regulating water levels, that's the pond leveler idea that we talked about, and basically creating conditions where the beaver can still live in their pond. We can maintain the depth that they need, but by having sort of ensuring a flow of water longer throughout the season, it draws that water down later on. And then just thinking about things on a watershed level. I mean, we've got a large community here, even with us tonight, that hopefully, you can take some of this information back to your local neighbors, or we can continue to build, a community of understanding and tolerance around beaver. So with that, I have just a few acknowledgements that I'd like to say. A lot of the photos that were provided by a number of different partners and people out there that are, capturing these types of images with their cameras, as well as some of the historical imagery from the Glenbow archives. If you want to know a little bit more about cows and fish, there's our website, and there's access to publications, fact sheets around beaver, but also around grazing management, crops, creeks and sloughs, biodiversity, things like that. Cows and Fish has a data collection tool called Riparian Health Assessment, where if you're curious about the condition and function of your riparian area related to all those benefits that can be provided, that's a service that we offer. There's also, digital stories, videos, and podcasts too, where people just like yourselves have come together and put together, little 3-minute videos about their experiences just living and working on the landscape. And we've also got a YouTube channel and Facebook and social media and all that good stuff. So in addition to ALUS and Northern Sunrise County and the County of Grand Prairie, I want to recognize these other funders that are helping out with our Beaver Collaborative overall throughout Alberta. This Rockies.ca website is a really great resource that I think Becky put into the chat, and it'll also get you primed for what we're going to talk about next week as well. And Cows and Fish, being a not-for-profit organization, we do have a number of members and supporters that allow us to do what we do on a daily basis. So I want to thank them, including the producers, municipalities, and community groups throughout Alberta that give us the opportunity to share our knowledge and share our information, and also the opportunity to learn from you. So part 2 of this series is going to happen next week, same time, same place. And we're going to touch more in detail on some of the beaver coexistence tools and how they're used, as well as different examples of where other jurisdictions are living and dealing with beavers, so that municipalities and cities and larger watersheds can get a sense of where beaver might be able to help out.
Carrie?
Yes.
I have a question here.
Okay.
How many trees could a Lodge family take down in a week?
That's a good question. I guess what's the person's experience that may be asking that question?
Karina, do you want to speak?
Yeah, sorry. I was actually just curious, that was all, because I saw the picture and I just wondered how long that would take for them to clear that amount that you had in that picture.
Right. Yeah. I don't have a timeline on it. I would think that within a week, I think they can probably get after it. 1 tree a day is my guess. So yeah, it would take a while.
Thank you.
So we're going to do the question and answer, continue the question and answer period. But before we do that, I'm hoping that you guys can sort of give an indication of, since you've heard this part one, you know, how has your beaver ecology management and the role of beavers on the landscape sort of changed or stayed the same? Okay. Good. Everybody's improved a little bit. That's what I like to see. Then the next, I think I went right into the next poll here, Becky. Just expanding on that one. You know, what specifically do you think you can say you've learned something new about, or have you have a better understanding about? And then will you be joining us for part two? And for that first question, you can check as many as you like. All right, well, that's excellent. I'm looking forward to seeing you all again.
Okay, so I had an ALUS presentation, but it's getting late. So we're just going to talk a little bit about what we're doing up here in Northern Sunrise County with our ALUS program. So truly, you people are the boots on the ground that are making a difference 1 acre at a time. So coexistence tools are a great passion of mine. And while I was chatting with Katie of Peace Country Beef and Forage last year, we realized we had the same interest. And through forming a partnership, Katie and I began the search for a willing producer to install a pond leveling device. This should have been easy, right? But it wasn't so easy. We knew of locations that could use such a device, but landowners aren't always keen on this new way of thinking. And without the landowner's support and engagement, the projects might not turn out as well as what they could. So how could we overcome this challenge? Well, Facebook to the rescue. We posted an ad on our general forums that we were looking for landowners that embraced coexistence tools. We asked, and within hours, the Serenes responded. The Serenes are avid wildlife supporters, but they weren't happy about the flooding on their farmland due to beaver dams. And like most, they've been digging out the dams only to find them rebuilt by the next morning. They could see it was time for an alternative method of control and happily jumped on board to install our first pond leveler in the county. As you can see, they have a large waterway running through the center of their property with several dams on it. Our primary concern was the water that was backing up into the field in this area. To assist mitigating the loss of the cropland, we've entered 2 acres into the ALUS program and the surrounding riparian area. And we put a pond leveler in here. So this is a perfect example of shifting production from traditional cropping to environmental services. The Serenes also entered about 8 acres of wetlands into the program to ensure the conservation of this area. And here's a nice drone shot of the area. Honestly, when you're in there, it's magical when you're in there. So this here is where we put the pond leveler. And this was done in October of 2020. And this would be the channel where it was backing up and it was spilling over onto the field here. They did put a culvert in here for equipment passage. So that's another area of interest that we'll be looking at. And here's Diane on May 10th of this year. They sent me an email and they said the pipe was flowing with 0 maintenance and the annual flooding was mitigated. So when we have success stories like this, we're so super excited to install more pond levelers in the county. So in our projects, I'm missing half my presentation, but our projects would not be possible without the funds we receive from ALUS Canada, from Government of Alberta, Northern Sunrise County with their Riparian Improvement Fund. We've received funding through ACA, Alberta Conservation, through their large grant in conservation and education. We've received federal funding through the Environmental Damages Fund. And at the center of it, we have our producer. Often ALUS Northern Sunrise can access resources that are not readily available to individuals, which we can then pass along to you, the producers. It's with the assistance of various non-government partners that the ALUS program is an effective mechanism for technical support. I am the program coordinator. I am here to help bring all of us together so we can bring these environmental visions to fruition. ALUS Northern Sunrise is a strong program, but we would not be where we are today without the essential partnerships we have developed in the county, province, and across the country. The strength of the team is each individual member, and the strength of each member is the team. So if you're in Northern Sunrise County and want to coexist with wildlife, please reach out. Your project could be a fit for our program. And thank you so much for joining us tonight.
And if you're not in Northern Sunrise County, there are, I believe, 11 alternative land use services program communities throughout Alberta.
There are 14.
So, we're up to 14.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thanks, Becky. So there's likely a person similar to Becky, in your neighborhood. And even I remember now that there's people around Calgary or from Calgary on this webinar. The city of Calgary actually has a really great website too, where they talk about urban beaver management and some of the things that the city has undertaken, and they've got tutorials on how to wrap trees and things like that. So so that may be a good resource for people as well, even if you're not in the city, but if you are, then that's right there in your backyard.
So yeah. So yes, we are up to 14 communities in Alberta, and Northern Sunrise is our most northerly. So there's a lot in the south. So just go to alus.ca and you'll be able to find one that's close to you. That kind of sounded like a sales pitch. It is. I'm selling the environment.
Well, there's a lot of different tools and opportunities out there, that people can take advantage of. So, and again, not only for, ALUS is an agricultural program, but there are other programs that would be applicable to urban environments, maybe smaller rural communities as well. Okay. Well, I think if we don't have any other burning questions, then we'll sign off, and thank everyone very much for attending. And we look forward to seeing you in a week.
Yes. Good night, everyone, and thank you for your participation.